Hi, my name is Hannah and welcome back to Hannah's Royal Histories. Today we'll be concluding our three-part series on Lord Guildford Dudley with the final chapter of his tragic story, from his arrest in July 1553 to his execution on Tower Hill in February 1554. This is a story of family loyalty, religious conviction, political miscalculation, and ultimately the price paid by the young for the ambitions of their elders. On Monday the 24th of July 1553, just 5 days after Mary's triumphant proclamation as Queen, the Dudley family's world collapsed entirely. John Dudley was arrested by Henry FitzAlan, the Earl of Arundel, the very man who had once been part of his inner circle. John Dudley was returned to the Tower of London. His worst nightmares upon leaving had been realised. The scale of the family's downfall was breathtaking. His brother and 4 sons, John, Ambrose, Robert and Harry, joined him there. His wife, remaining son Guildford, and daughter-in-law had not left their palace, having been abruptly transformed into their prison. The indignity of their situation was immediately apparent. Guildford's brother, Robert, would join him in his cell, and the Tower jailer would serve them all at table, a sure sign of how far the Dudley family and Jane had fallen. The same tower where Guildford had dined in regal isolation just days before was now his prison, and the servants who had once addressed him as Your Grace were replaced by jailers. In those early weeks of her reign, Queen Mary showed a restraint that would later seem almost believable. On the 3rd of August 1553, Mary entered London with her half-sister Elizabeth at her side, and began to demonstrate her desire to avoid what David Baldwin describes as a political or religious bloodbath. Her approach to Jane's father was particularly telling. On the 30th of July 1553, she formally pardoned the Duke of Suffolk after granting Francis Grey a private audience. This remarkable mercy Suffolk had received after everything that he'd been through, he had been at the very heart of the conspiracy against her, don't forget, was remarkable. And I think it speaks more to Mary's relationship with Francis. Mary's religious policy was equally moderate at first. In her pronouncement of the 18th of August, she stated that although she would be glad if her people reconciled to Catholicism, she was minded not to compel them, and begs them not to use those newfound devilish terms of papist or heretic. The spirit of reconciliation, however, was not reciprocated by Jane Grey. Baldwin notes a stark contrast in a letter Jane wrote around this time, in which she described Catholics as Romish antichrists, their church as the whore of Babylon, and urged her correspondent to turn from the most wicked mass. While Mary preached tolerance, Jane remained utterly uncompromising in her Protestant convictions. Behind the Tower walls, the brief and troubled marriage of Jane and Guildford was finally laying bare all its fractures and resentments. Jane wrote revealing letters to Queen Mary that exposed the deep dysfunction in her relationship with both her husband and his family. In one letter, she protested that the Duchess of Northumberland had induced her son to no longer sleep with her, a continuation of the power struggle that had begun during their brief reign. In another, more poignant letter, Jane describes herself as a wife who loves her husband, but revealed that Guildford had disappointed her for being dominated by his mother. This was perhaps the most telling insight into their relationship. Despite everything, the political marriage, the crown dispute, the separate lodgings, Jane still claimed to love Guildford. But she was bitterly disappointed that he had allowed his mother to manipulate him so completely. Jane informed Mary that she had been betrayed by the Duke of Northumberland, by the council, and by her husband, and she had been mistreated by her mother-in-law. For Jane, the betrayals came from all sides. Political betrayal came from Northumberland and the council, who had used her. Personal betrayal from Guildford, who had prioritised his mother's wishes over his wife's authority, and social betrayal from the Duchess of Northumberland, who had treated her with contentment despite her royal blood. While the Dudley men languished in the Tower, one member of the family was free and fighting desperately for their lives. The Duchess of Northumberland, Jane Dudley, had been released and was mounting what can only be described as a heroic campaign to save her children. She attempted to make her way to Queen Mary to request mercy for her children. Mary refused to give her an audience and ordered her to return to the Tower. This must have been a devastating blow for a woman who had once held such power and influence, although it was only 13 days. The same queen who had shown mercy to the Duke of Suffolk would not even grant her an audience. But the Duchess didn't give up. Nearly 2 months after the execution of her husband, it was reported that the Dowager Duchess was doing everything in her power to secure a pardon for her children. Her persistence eventually bore some fruit. Eventually, the Queen issued a reprieve for Guildford's brothers, Ambrose and Henry. 2 of her sons would be saved, but Guildford remained under the shadow of the axe. On the 18th of August 1553, the executions began. Northumberland, Warwick and Northampton were brought to trial at Westminster Hall, to be followed by Gates, Palmer, Palmer's brother Henry, and Northumberland's brother Sir Andrew Dudley. The next day, Lady Jane, Guildford, and the others were to be dealt with later. The trials were, as Baldwin notes, mere formalities. The examinations were formal and the verdicts predetermined. It had already been decided that only Northumberland, Gates, and Palmer would die, although Northumberland still hoped for clemency. In his final hours, the once mighty Duke of Northumberland made a decision that would horrify his daughter-in-law. He asked for the favour of beheading, quicker and more dignified than being hanged, drawn and quartered, and for time to be reconciled to the Catholic faith. This was perhaps his last desperate bid for a pardon, but it only bought him 1 extra day of life. Jane's reaction to Northumberland's conversion was one of utter disgust. Jane, seeing her father-in-law pass by on his way to Mass in the Tower Chapel, dismissed his change of heart as false and evil. "I pray God," she remarked afterwards, "that I, nor no friend of mine, die so." For Jane, dying in the Protestant faith was more important than living through compromise. By the 29th of August 1553, with Northumberland dead and buried, Jane was clear about where the blame lay. She blamed Northumberland for her trouble and her family's trouble and grief. Through September and October of 1553, the prisoners lived in a strange sort of limbo. Their death sentences hung over them, but there seemed genuine reason for hope. The Lieutenant of the Tower had allowed Cranmer and the Dudley brothers, including Guildford, access to the gardens. Near Jane's lodgings, they may have had contacts there. Jane's conditions were relatively comfortable. She retained the services of her 4 servants and had ample allowance for her upkeep and could dine with the gaoler when she chose. The fact that she was allowed servants and could choose her dining companions suggests that her execution was not considered imminent. All the accused had pleaded guilty and were formally sentenced to death. But, as Baldwin notes, none now expected to be executed. A period of imprisonment was inevitable, but the clemency that had allowed the crimes of others to go unpunished would surely be extended to them. On the 13th of November 1553, the moment Jane and Guildford had been dreading finally arrived. At the Guildhall in London, they arraigned Guildford for treason together with his wife, his brothers Ambrose, Henry and Thomas Cranmer, Archbishop of Canterbury. The choice of venue was deliberate and cruel. As Eric Ives explains, Jane's trial was deliberately demeaning. She and the others accused were commoners. Not for them the privacy of a boat to Westminster, Their trial was set for London's Guildhall. This meant a mile walk through the busy streets of the city and gave the government an opportunity to make the most of the humiliation of defeat. The procession to the Guildhall was designed as a spectacle of fallen power. 400 halberds were on duty, not to guarantee safety, but to demonstrate power. The symbolism was carefully orchestrated. First on this Via Dolorosa came the officer carrying the great axe, with the blade turned away from the prisoners, to show that for a short time they would still be innocent in the eyes of the law. A contemporary chronicler recorded the exact order of the procession. On this day in November they were led out of the tower on foot, to be arraigned to the Guildhall with the axe before them. From their ward Thomas Cranmer, Archbishop of Canterbury. Next followed the Lord Dudley. Next followed the Lady Jane, and her gentlewomen following her. Next followed the Lord Ambrose Dudley and the Lord Harry Dudley. Even in this moment of public humiliation, both Jane and Guildford made statements through their appearances. Guildford was dressed dashingly in a black velvet suit, slashed with white satin. Jane, behind him, had chosen plain black, and strikingly she was carrying an open prayer book in her hands with another covered in black velvet hanging from her waist. It was a public statement of Protestant piety. The contrast is fascinating. Guildford still dressed with the flair of a nobleman, while Jane's plain black and prominent prayer books announced her religious convictions to the watching crowds. The charges against Guildford revealed the government's carefully constructed legal case. They did not accuse him of having tried to usurp the crown or of assuming undeserved titles. Instead, his crime encompassed attempting to depose Queen Mary by sending troops to his father, and of receiving, honouring, and proclaiming his wife as queen. The accusations were more specifically detailed as falsely and treacherously helping, aiding, abetting, and assisting the said Jane against his due diligence, and against the peace of the Queen, her crown, and dignity. According to Ives, Jane and Guildford were charged with high treason for taking possession of the tower and proclaiming Jane, while she faced the additional charge of signing various writings. When it came to entering their pleas, both Jane and Guildford made the same choice. As Nicola Tallis records, Jane and Guildford stood side by side in Guildhall, within the City of London, and both pleaded guilty to the charges of treason that were brought against them. There was no point in denying the obvious. The facts were undisputed, even if the interpretation of those facts seemed to bear little relation to their lived experience. The sentences were as brutal as they were traditional. The men received the full traitor's punishment, to be dragged through the middle of the City of London to the gallows of Tyburn, and there hung and laid out rotting on the ground, and their interior organs should be brought outside of their stomachs, and as these rot, they should be burned, and their heads should be cut off, and their bodies should be divided into 4 quarters, and their heads and quarters should be placed where the Queen wishes them to be assigned. Jane, as a woman, faced a different horror. She was to be burned or decapitated, as it will then please the Queen. Queen Mary showed mercy in commuting their sentences to simple decapitation. As they left the Guildhall, the edge of the axe turned towards them, the sign that they were indeed condemned traitors. By December 1553, the terms of their imprisonment were relaxed, though Nicola Tallis notes that it seems improbable that they were allowed to converse together. Neither is there any evidence that they wished to. This is perhaps telling about the state of their marriage. Even with relaxed conditions, there's no evidence they sought each other's company. Even if she was unable to speak to her husband, Jane could have seen him after they moved him to the bell tower. These lodgings were reserved for more prestigious prisoners. The move to better quarters seemed to suggest that their executions were not imminent. Baldwin captured the mood of cautious optimism. It is likely that all those involved in the conspiracy would have been pardoned eventually if the situation had remained calm and unthreatening, but they had not reckoned with the backlash provoked by Mary's wish to marry Philip of Spain. In January 1554, everything changed. The discovery of the Wyatt rebellion, in which Jane's father was carelessly involved, forced Queen Mary's hand, and she was left with no choice but to order the executions of Jane and Guildford. The rebellion was a disaster for Jane and Guildford, not because they were involved, but because they weren't. See, Jane's father, the Duke of Suffolk, was carelessly involved in the rebellion, and it made it impossible for Mary to continue showing mercy to his daughter. So, on the 10th of February 1554, Henry Grey was arrested and arrived in the Tower of London as a prisoner. Even then, Mary hesitated. Despite this state of affairs, Queen Mary was still inclined to issue a reprieve over Jane and Guildford's conviction and death sentence. But Simon Reynard, the Habsburg ambassador, as well as the Queen's Council, put enough pressure on her to concede. With Philip of Spain's arrival imminent, the risk was just too great to bear. As the couple prepared to meet their ends, both their thoughts turned to Jane's father, the man whose actions had sealed their fate. Both Jane and Guildford wrote the Duke of Suffolk a farewell message. Both of these messages survive in the pages of Jane's tiny prayer book, demonstrating that this was an object to which Guildford had access to at some point too. Nicola Tallis wonders, there is no clue as to how this was contrived. Did Jane and Guildford meet, or at least have opportunity to converse and agree to write her father a final note? It is improbable that they met, and it was probably managed with the connivance of the Lieutenant of the Tower, Sir John Bridges. Guildford's message, the only example of his handwriting that survives, reads, "Your loving and obedient son wishes unto your grace long life in this world, as much joy and comfort as I ever wished to myself, and in the world to come joy everlasting. Your humble son to his death, G. Dudley." As noted on the Tudor Chest podcast, this writing tells us it was written near Guildford's execution, and that he knew that death was coming. The tone is formal, dutiful, but not bitter, remarkable considering that Suffolk's actions had doomed them both. On the evening of the 11th February 1554, the night before the executions were due to take place, a contemporary recorded that Guildford requested one final meeting with his wife. This request is deeply revealing. As Nicola Tallis observes, the fact that Guildford asked for such a meeting is suggestive of the fact that he had either developed some kind of feelings for his wife, however small, or that he perhaps wished to apologise to Jane for his past behaviour before their day of reckoning. Perhaps in facing death, Guildford finally understood what he had lost. Not just his life, but the possibility of a real relationship with the remarkable woman that he had married. Jane's response was both touching and heartbreaking. A papal agent in London reported that Jane refused the request, believing a meeting would be too painful for them both. She sent him a message stating that they would soon be together eternally. Jane explained her reasoning more fully, saying that meeting him would only increase their misery and pain. It was better to put it off, as they would meet elsewhere, live bound by indissoluble ties. The theological language is striking. Indissoluble ties suggests she saw their marriage as something that would continue beyond death, a bond that execution could not break. On the 12th February 1554, Guildford Dudley's brief life came to an end. It was a cold February morning. No one could have faulted the youth for trembling. He was executed at around 10 a.m. They agreed to execute Guildford first on Tower Hill, and then his wife on Tower Green. The public execution on Tower Hill was designed to send a message. Jane's more private execution within the Tower precincts was a recognition of her royal blood. At the outer gates, Guildford found well-wishers, and he begged them to pray for him. He shook hands with two men who were Catholic and supporters of Queen Mary. This detail is remarkable. Even on his way to execution, Catholic supporters of Mary were willing to shake his hand and offer comfort. No priest accompanied him to the scaffold, showing he remained devoted to the reform of the Church. Like his wife, Guildford would die as he had lived, a committed Protestant, unwilling to compromise his faith for his life. He spoke to the crowd on his short walk to Tower Hill, but we do not know what was said. We can only imagine what final thoughts this young man shared with the watching crowd. On the scaffold, he was composed. On the scaffold, his composure was remarkable. He knelt and prayed, turning his eyes and hands to God many times. He then turned to the crowd and asked for people to pray for him. Finally, showing the courage expected of a nobleman, he put his neck on the block, and the executioner killed him with one single blow of the axe. The aftermath of Guildford's execution provides one of the most poignant moments in this tragic story. They put his body on a cart and brought him back to the Tower. But Jane was watching. On her way to her own execution, Jane viewed his body being unloaded and taken to the church of St. Peter ad Vincula. Jane had insisted on watching from a window, even though her ladies tried to dissuade her. Why did Jane insist on witnessing this horrific sight? Perhaps she felt she owed it to the young man who had asked to see her one last time. Perhaps she needed to see the reality of death before facing her own. Or, even in those final hours, she finally understood that despite everything, the political marriage, the crown dispute, the family interference, she had genuinely cared for Guildford. 2 hours later, Jane herself was executed on Tower Green. Jane was unabashed at seeing her husband's corpse. She wore the same dress that she wore when she was proclaimed queen, black, carrying a prayer book and escorted/supported by two gentlewomen who wept at her death. Even in death, she remained uncompromising. The same black dress, the same prayer book, the same Protestant faith. The executions of Jane and Guildford shocked contemporaries. These were not hardened political conspirators or even ambitious adults. These were teenagers who had been caught up in Tudor politics. Contemporaries regarded Guildford as a victim of his father's intrigues and were sympathetic. This sympathy crossed religious and political lines. Even supporters of Queen Mary could see that Guildford had been manipulated by forces beyond his control. Grafton's abridgment of the Chronicles of England, written in 1563, captured the general sentiment. Grafton described Guildford as a comely, virtuous and goodly gentleman, who was mostly innocently executed, whom God had endowed with such virtues that even those that had never before the time of his execution saw him, did with lamentable tears bewail his death. The emphasis on his innocence and virtue, and the fact that even strangers wept for him, suggests that Guildford's execution was widely seen as a tragedy rather than justice. G.J. Richardson's assessment in the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography is more measured, but still sympathetic. Of Guildford Dudley's character or his feelings for Lady Jane, there is only slight evidence. But the evidence that does exist, his final letter, his request to see Jane, his dignified behaviour at his execution, suggests a young man who, whatever his earlier failings, met his death with courage and grace. So what can we make of Guildford Dudley's short life and tragic death? Well, for a few brief days in July 1553, he had been to all intents and purposes King of England. He had been addressed as Your Grace and Your Excellence, and sat at the head of council meetings. He had been recognised by others abroad as the King of England. but the political calculation that had elevated him also doomed him. His father's ambition, his mother's manipulation, his wife's royal bloodline, and his own youthful expectations all combined to place him in an impossible position. In the end, Guildford Dudley paid the ultimate price, not for his own ambitions, but for being the son his father needed, the husband Jane's bloodline required, and the pawn that political circumstances demanded. His story is a reminder that in the ruthless world of Tudor politics, youth was no protection, innocence no defence, and noble blood could be as much of a curse as it was a blessing. And so ends the tragic story of Lord Guildford Dudley, a young man whose 19 years encompass one of the most dramatic political upheavals in English history. From the fourth son of an ambitious duke, to briefly being styled as England's future king, to dying on Tower Hill as one of the youngest victims of the Tudor succession crisis. His story reminds us that behind the grand narratives of political history are real people, young people who paid the price for ambitions, miscalculations, and religious conflicts of their elders. Guildford may have been naive, may have been manipulated, may have made poor choices, but he was also, as contemporaries recognise, largely innocent of the crimes for which he died. So if you enjoyed this 3-part series on Guildford Dudley, then please give this video a like, subscribe to my channel for more stories from the Tudor world, and thank you for watching. And of course, as always, have a wonderful day.